folks. Welcome back to the Podcast Digest. My name's Dan Lizette, and this is episode 90 of the Podcast Digest. Cannot believe we've done 90 of these. But before we jump into this week's show, I wanted to take just a moment and mention again, many of you who've been listening, especially for the last couple of months, know that I am now on Patreon, and it is a great way to sort of help out the Podcast Digest, and via this means I may be able to someday realize some pretty big plans I have to sort of expand the scope of the show, maybe even the frequency of episodes. So if you've not had a chance yet to check out the link, there's a link in the show notes for Patreon. For as little as $1 a month, you can help make that reality happen. In addition, I have a brand new Patreon supporter I'd like to thank. He's a previous guest, a new addition to the Libsyn team. If you listen to the feed from Libsyn, you have probably heard. And he is an all-around awesome guy. Dave Jackson has come aboard as a Patreon supporter. Dave has a few different shows, but if you're a new podcaster or considering starting one, I'd like to point you in the direction of his excellent School of Podcasting. I know I've learned loads of tips from Dave and his show, and it's definitely one worth checking out if you are a podcast aficionado or a budding one. So thank you, Dave. I greatly appreciate your support, and I will have links to School of Podcasting and Dave in the show notes as well. So on to this week's show, folks. Not too long ago, a new podcast came across my radar, and upon listening to the first episode or two, I knew it was a keeper. The name of that show was Home, Stories from LA, and since that time, the show has grown big time, and it's taken its well-deserved place on my must-play list. The host's name is Bill Barol. Bill, I hope I'm saying that right, and he's my guest on this week's Podcast Digest. Bill, welcome.
Thank you, Dan. I appreciate it, and yes, right out of the box, you pronounced my name correctly, which is a big plus. So thank you for that.
You did a previous interview, I heard, with someone, I think, and I heard them pronounce it that way for the first time and realized I think I was doing this wrong.
Don't worry about it. Most people do. It usually takes people about half a year of pronouncing my name to get it right. So you're ahead of the curve.
I think I was doing Barol for a while, but Barol is correct.
It is technically correct, yes.
Well, great. Before we jump into your show, Bill, and there's so many awesome things to talk about with that, I want folks to kind of get to know a little bit about you personally before Home and before podcasting. I know I've familiarized myself a little bit with your resume. I attempted to dig a little bit into the PDF from your website, the 31-page Jerry Lewis thing. Got about halfway through while working today, but I don't want to spoil anything, folks. If you could tell them a little bit about sort of your past and background, kind of your upbringing and your road to starting this show.
Sure. I sort of started my professional life. I came out of college. I went to work for Newsweek in the early 80s in New York, and I started there as the first reporter on a publication that doesn't exist anymore called Newsweek on Campus, which was a supplement that was sent to Newsweek college subscribers. And from there, I managed to sort of weasel my way over to the official, to the mothership, to working for Newsweek itself. And I was there for about 8 years. And I kind of bounced all over the back of the book. And the story you're talking about is actually the one that most people remember from that time, if they remember anything I did at all. And it was a story from 1987 called I Stayed Up with Jerry. And I had the idea to fly to Las Vegas from New York, where I was living at the time, and sit in the audience for the entire 21 and a half hours of the Jerry Lewis Labor Day telethon, and write a kind of sleep-deprived, real-time diary of the thing. And this was long before people were live blogging things. And I checked out I think it was a TRS-80, one of those old clunky square laptops. And I arranged to go, and I sat there for 21 and a half hours, and I came back and I dropped the enormous first draft of the story, the printout, on my editor's desk, a woman named Dominique Browning. And she sort of looked at it. It was about 4 inches thick. And she looked at it, and she looked at me, and she looked at the printout, and she looked at me, and she said, okay, I see, I get it. I see what you're doing here. You want me to kill this so you can sell it to Rolling Stone. And I said, no, not, if you wanted to, but she didn't. Fortunately, she was able to figure out a way to get it down to, I think it was 3 or 4 pages in the magazine. And it ended up running in Newsweek, along with a bunch of other stories that I did at the time, cover stories on David Letterman and Bruce Springsteen and a bunch of other things. And I left there in the early 90s because I got a chance to come out here to Los Angeles, which was not a place that I had ever particularly given any thought to living, to do a job that I had never particularly given any thought to doing, which is, out of the blue, somebody offered me a job writing on a sitcom. And I was too naive at the time to know that this was the sort of opportunity that just doesn't tend to come along for most people. And I thought, oh yeah, I'll try that. And I came out here. I took a leave of absence from Newsweek, and I came out here and tried it for, I think it was 6 months. It was a series called Anything But Love. It was a sitcom on ABC with Richard Lewis and Jamie Lee Curtis. And I liked the work, and I liked the people. You sit in a room with a bunch of really smart, funny people, and you laugh a lot. And I came back to New York and sort of figured out whether I wanted to kind of roll the dice on TV, and decided to do that. And so I came back out here in 1990 and worked in TV for almost 10 years before TV and I had a parting of the ways, at which time I felt very lucky to have something to go back to, which was journalism. And I freelanced for, the better part of another decade or so. I wrote for Time and Fast Company and some other magazines, mostly business magazines, and started doing some writing online during that time. Fell into writing for Boing Boing and some other places. Published a couple of books along the way, and sort of went along that path until about a year ago when I got this harebrained idea to try a podcast, and that kind of brings us up to the present.
And Boing Boing's going to come up again in just a little while as well. But I want to go back and kind of touch on, I imagine you have had a career and experiences ripe with amazing stories, whether it be from days of a journalist or writing with TV or what have you. Going back to sort of the Newsweek days, we touched a little bit on Jerry Lewis. Was there any other stories that either you were particularly proud of or kind of you look back and say that was an absolutely crazy process? Any ones that kind of stick out in your mind?
I think one of the best interviews that I ever did was with Penn and Teller, the magicians. And it was when they were just starting to get well known, and they were doing a little two-person show at the West Side Arts Theater in New York. And we got wind of it, and they sent me over to take a look at it. And I was just, I'd never seen anything like it, Nobody really knew who Penn and Teller were at the time. They were just kind of in the process of getting started. And so, to see those guys and see what they did and what they were able to do in a kind of theatrical setting just was sort of mind-blowing. And I went to interview them the next day, and we went to a place in the Theater District in New York. And we did the interview, and it was, I think not just in retrospect, but I think I remember thinking at the time that it was one of the best interviews I'd ever done. It was just one of those days when everybody around the table was sort of touched with magic. I was on my game, and they were fabulous. And I got back to the office, and I took my cassette recorder out of my bag, and there was nothing on the tape.
Oh, no.
It was the writer's nightmare, right?
Oh, no.
And
writer, podcaster, all of our nightmares.
Absolutely. Yeah. And that was the day I learned one of the essential lessons about reporting, which is always put fresh batteries in your recorder before you do an interview. It sounds so simple, but it's such a basic lesson, and boy, howdy, did I learn it that day. So I called the publicist, and I fell on my sword, and I groveled, and they were very nice to come back and do the whole interview again the next day. And it was not as good as the one that got away, because
of course not.
But yeah. But I was able to reconstruct the story. So there were, I was writing in the back of the book, and I was covering a lot of pop music and entertainment. It was an interesting time. It was an interesting beat because that stuff was a little under the radar at Newsweek at that time. And so I was kind of able to carve out my own beat and sell them a lot of oddball stories. It was also a time in news magazines, and Newsweek kind of led the way in this a little bit of where writers, particularly in the back of the book sections, were able to write with a little more identity and a little more snap and a little more humor. And so I was able to get away with some things that were fairly unconventional for a news magazine at the time. And the Jerry Lewis story is probably the best example of that. And as I say, I still meet people now who remember that story, and so that's very gratifying. I got to meet some people who were heroes of mine. Bruce Springsteen and Chuck Jones, the Warner Brothers animator, were two who came to mind. So it was a good time. It was it was a time when news magazines kind of bestrode the earth like colossuses or colossi. It was a good time to be in the news business, and I enjoyed every minute of it.
I'm sure you've asked yourself this question a lot. You when you tell the story about kind of how you transitioned to television writing, it seemed to be sort of out of the blue. But looking back, do you think that there was something in your writing style, maybe at Newsweek in the entertainment section, that somebody in television said, you know what, he might be great for this sitcom? Do you have any idea kind of how that ever happened?
Yeah, and it's a lot more prosaic than that, and a lot less flattering to me. It was the guy who hired me is a guy named Peter Noah, who's still a friend of mine, still in the TV business, and his brother and I went to college together, and I knew the family. And Peter had taken over Anything But Love after the first kind of half a season, and it was a sitcom that was set in the magazine business. And so Peter came to New York when he was in the process of taking over the show, and he asked me to show him around Newsweek, and I said, of course I would, even though there was nothing in particular to show him. I mean, we walked around a bunch of very dull-looking floors filled with cubicles and lit with fluorescent light with bad carpet on the floor. Newsweek was then at 444 Madison, between 49th and 50th on Madison. And so I showed him around, and he thanked me for that and kind of filed it away as research and went on his way. And then a few months later, when the show came back for its second half, the back nine, what they call the back nine in the TV business. He called me up. They had a freelance script to give out, and he thought that I would be, I would be reasonably well qualified to do it. And he was completely wrong about that, because I was totally in over my head. I had absolutely no idea what I was doing, and but they were all very kind about the quality of the work. It was thoroughly rewritten, almost down to the paragraph, because that's what happens in TV. But that was kind of the start of it. So it was really just the fact that I had a magazine background, and Peter was doing a show about magazines.
Well, at least that makes sense.
Yeah,
that seems to fit.
It
right?
It made perfect logical sense. And later on, I discovered that I had some facility for it, but boy, that first script was a mess. It was terrible. Oh God, it was terrible.
Well, one might say nowadays you're sort of in your third major medium, if you will. Looking back at the journalism days or the TV writing days, print and television, if you will, anything you particularly miss about those days or aspects that you look back fondly on?
Yeah, there was a lot I look back fondly on. Some of which is not particular to those businesses. I do tend to look back fondly on being a young guy in my 20s, living in New York, and having fallen by real dumb luck into a job at what was then the center of the journalism universe. And I would, and I think I was aware of this even at the time. I hope it isn't just in retrospect, but I have a memory of coming up out of the subway. I was living on the Upper West Side, and I would come up out of the subway at 50th and Broadway, and walk east on 50th Street, and you would walk past 30 Rock, where NBC was. You would walk past the Time Life building, and I would walk to my job at Newsweek at 49th and Madison. And in that one stretch of 49th and 50th Street, you had a tremendous concentration of what was at the time really the very heart of institutional power in the journalism business. And to be a part of that at a young age was at a time when all of those institutions were tremendously influential. Was a heady thing for a young guy. So like a lot of people, I sort of look back longingly on that time, because it was the time when I was a young guy just starting out, and I met the woman who is now my wife. So that was also a good thing. And as I say, I had a lot of freedom and a lot of liberty, and I was kind of flying under the radar at Newsweek a lot of the time. And I got away with some things that institutionally were unusual for Newsweek at the time. As I say, and part of that was because just the institution itself was in the process of changing fairly radically, and I was lucky enough to get in at a time when that was happening.
So here's my segue question into home. You mentioned your relocation to LA and also obviously all this time you spent in New York. What are the differences between LA and New York? What are some of the pros and cons if somebody's considering moving to either place right now? What is I know they're two very different places. What are sort of the pros and cons of each?
Well, I don't know as much about New York as I did when I lived there. My wife and I moved out here. It's now, somebody asked me about it the other day, and I realized it's now been 26 years that we've lived out here, which was absolutely stunning to me, because I've now lived here. It's a place that, as I said, I never really intended to live. I never planned to live here, but I look back and realized I've now lived here longer than any place I've ever lived, including Philadelphia, where I grew up. So I've been out here a long time, and in that process, in that time, I think New York has changed an awful lot, and I've had the opportunity to see that going back on visits. I think Manhattan, where I lived, has become, my impression of it as a visitor now is that it's become a lot more kind of like London and maybe some other places, where it's a place for rich oligarchs and their privileged kids. And I have a sense of regret about that when I go back to New York now, because I think it's become a place that is a lot less varied and interesting, at least in Manhattan where I lived. Some of the more interesting stuff has moved to the outer boroughs, where it was always going on. But as far as the part of town that I considered home, it's kind of been forced out of there, and I think that's too bad. Los Angeles, one of the big differences, one of the obvious differences, is that Los Angeles is a place, although even this is changing now, where you really kind of are chained to a motor vehicle if you want to get around.
Right.
But not far from where I'm living, the last leg of the Expo line is going in out here, which is the light rail line, which is going to connect Culver City to downtown Santa Monica. And so there are a lot more opportunities now for people to not be locked into their cars. But I've been here long enough now to have seen Santa Monica, where I live, kind of get overdeveloped and over-trafficked. The character of the town is changing. I kind of fought the California thing for a while. When I came out here as a New Yorker, for a long time I considered myself to still be a New Yorker, and I was kind of long-term visiting in Los Angeles, and then, as kind of without even really being very aware of it, and it's a story that I tell in the first episode, the introductory episode of the podcast. The place kind of became my home. It happened almost while I wasn't paying attention, and one day, and I suspect this is the way it is with a lot of people. I looked around and I realized, well, this is my home now. I'm home. This is it. And you may not be aware of that moment when it happens, or that transitional process. That it's longer than a moment when it's happening. But one day you wake up and there you are. I feel lucky to have lived in places on both sides of the coast and on both sides of the country, both coasts, and they're certainly different experiences. But this has been the place where I've been for the longest now, and it is the place now that really does feel like home to me.
So tell me about the birth of the idea for the podcast. One, starting one in the first place, and two, the subject matter, that it is sort of LA-centric, if you will. How did this all get started for you? I was
about a year ago, I was getting ready to go out and visit my sister, who lives in Massachusetts on Cape Cod. And I had kind of, I come late to everything, and so I came late to podcasts as well. I had kind of dipped a toe into the podcast world a couple of years before. I'd listened to Marin and some of the other big ones, and then gotten distracted by something shiny and I never went back to it. And about a year ago, this was in the spring, I guess, or the late spring, early summer, was a time when the podcast thing was really starting to bubble. And I had 2 long plane flights ahead of me, and so I downloaded, I can't remember whether it was Castro or Overcast, one of the podcatchers, and just loaded it up with all sorts of podcasts to listen to on the flight. So I listened to podcasts all the way out from Los Angeles to Massachusetts, and while I was there, I had some long conversations with my sister, and And one of the things that she talked to me about was a notion that she has about how important it is to live your life with intentionality, to live intentionally, not to just sort of drift through your own life, to be an active participant in your own life. And I was in a period of a little bit of professional drift at the time. I'd continued to do print writing. As of about a year ago, I was mostly doing short humor pieces for The New Yorker. And I was doing okay with those, but I had this urge, and I think it was an inchoate urge. I didn't even really know that I'd felt it until this conversation with my sister sort of focused it for me. I'd had an urge to kind of get my arms around a bigger project, a longer-term project, something on a bigger scale, which I hadn't done since a few years ago when I wrote a fabulously unsuccessful novel called Thanks for Killing Me. And I wanted to do something that had some size and some scale again, but I didn't really have a clue about what that was. So I listened to a bunch more podcasts on the plane flight back, and I got off the plane at LAX, and I kind of had a light bulb moment. I thought, everybody else seems to be doing a podcast. This medium feels perfect to me in many ways, and I was enormously inspired, I have to say, by some of the stuff that I had listened to on both of those plane flights out and back, and in particular some of the narrative podcasts, the storytelling podcasts. I listened to a ton of podcasts, of episodes of a podcast that's almost immediately became my favorite podcast and still is to this day, which is Nate DiMeo's The Memory Palace.
Oh, yes.
Which is just an absolutely magnificent piece of work in every respect. And when people ask me now, what's a podcast I should listen to? I always tell them that they should start with The Memory Palace, and I even give them the episode that nailed me, which is an episode called Shadowboxing, about John L. Sullivan, the boxer, and that was a driveway moment for me, although I was on a plane at the time. And so I came back from that trip, and I thought I should be doing this, or at least I should give it a try. I didn't particularly have any confidence at the time that I could do it well, but I thought I had. As I thought about it, I figured there were probably three technical challenges that I had to figure out ways to surmount. The first one was to learn what the right, it was really technical, is learn what the right gear is. Right. And that, for me, for somebody like me, that was fun because I got to do a bunch of research into audio gear, and I got to order stuff and order stuff from Amazon and try it out and send stuff back to Amazon. The truck would pull up, the truck would leave. I was buying stuff, I was sending stuff back. I built a vocal closet where I am now, in a little closet off my office. A beautiful little vocal space with drapes and acoustic baffling. And then, just parenthetically, I found out sometime later that Nate DiMeo literally tracks under a blanket in his garage.
Yeah.
Which
I'd be surprised how many I've heard actually do that.
Yeah, including Nate. And when I heard that, I thought, oh, okay, I see. So it's not about the vocal closet. That's not what makes her a good podcast. So that was stage one, was sort of figuring out the technical aspects. Stage two, I thought, was learning the tools. And I fooled around like everybody does with GarageBand and Audacity. And I eventually landed on Logic Pro, which is kind of what works for me, although it's a vastly more sophisticated program than I know how to use, and I'm sure I'm not tapping a tenth of its potential. But finally, the third thing, and the thing I thought I wouldn't have to learn or acquire, is for the kind of podcast that I wanted to do, which is a reported narrative podcast, a storytelling podcast involving new original recording, that I had a little bit of a leg up there, or at least some experience in the technical practice of reporting, because I'd already been doing it for a long time. And I thought that was something that I was not going to have to teach myself. And so that would sort of help me jump the process along a little bit. And when I kind of broke it down into those three stages, I thought, well, this is something that I feel like I could at least try. And so I just sort of jumped into it, and it's now, whatever it is, 9 months later or so, 12 episodes in, and I'm still learning as I go. Absolutely, I have not mastered the tools by any means, but I'm developing a little technical facility as I go, and I'm having a real good time doing it, and the response has been terrific.
Oh, you mentioned Nate DeMeo, and just a quick aside here, we'll get back on track, but have you heard the recent news with him, some of the things that have been coming out with his progress, if you will?
I'm not sure I know what you're talking about.
Let's see here. He started to work on something with the Met, the art museum.
Oh,
He's,
yeah.
co-producing shows with them on some of the things in the museum. And then I heard just the other day he got brought on by MTV. He's going to help MTV launch their first 5 podcasts.
Get out of here. Well, good for him. That's great. Yeah. That's great. I did know about the thing with the Metropolitan Museum. He did a sort of a podcast installation, if you will, an audio piece specific to a gallery in the Metropolitan Museum, which is a great idea. But I'd not heard about the thing with MTV, and that's terrific.
Yeah.
Good for him.
Yeah, from Deadline on April 20th, there's an article that, they're launching 5 shows, and I believe Nate is involved in one of them. I'm not even sure exactly which one, but new director of Daily Video, Rachel Zarel, and podcast producers Mukta Mohan, Michael Quintano, Jane Marie, and Nate DeMeo.
That's
so
great.
He's now working with MTV.
Congratulations, Nate. That's great.
Can you believe that? And what's funny is he's one of the ones I've been kind of trying to reach out to bring in to talk to here, and now that he's doing all this stuff, he's not gonna have the time to join me, I'm sure.
Well, I hope he does. But he's been. That show is inspirational to me in a lot of ways. And one of the ways in which it's particularly inspirational is that I realized that it took him 6 years, almost 7 years now, to get to where he is. He's hooked up with Radiotopia, which is the perfect home. And to me, Radiotopia is the murderer's row of podcasting. It's the Mount Rushmore of podcasting. And Nate absolutely belongs on that in that firmament. But he didn't get there overnight, and I'm an impatient person. So every time I think, well, God, I'm 2 seasons in, I'm 12 episodes in, and I'm not on Radiotopia yet. I just calm down, simmer down. Nate DeMeo is the best there ever was, and it took him 6 years. So it's a good lesson.
He is excellent. I'm a huge fan of Radiotopia. I've worked through, I think, 2/3 of their roster at this point has joined me at one time or another. So I completely echo your sentiments about Radiotopia for sure. So let's get back to home. So you produce your first episode. What was that process like as you're trying some of those new elements, the technical side of things? How did you even select the topic for the first episode, and what was putting that first try together?
The short answer is I stole the idea from my wife. I mean, that's the truth of it. I knew that I wanted to do a narrative podcast. I knew that I wanted it to involve original reporting. I knew that I wanted it to be immaculately composed and produced to the best of my limited abilities, and that I wanted it to be serious but not sober. And there were elements I knew that I wanted to try to figure out how to include, including interviews and found sound and archival sound and music. So I had a general sense of what I wanted it to sound like. All I still needed was an idea. And Jennifer and I talked about a bunch of ideas, and she was the one who came up with this notion of doing something about home. And she reminded me about a conversation we'd had sometime previously where we were sort of marveling on this strange fact that Los Angeles had become our home. And how did that happen? What was that process like? And the idea sort of resonated with me right away because I had a sense, and I don't think I would have been able to verbalize it before Jennifer had pitched this idea about doing something about home, that what I was looking for was a kind of broad narrative framework inside which I could tell a whole bunch of different kinds of stories. And the notion of home, broadly defined, is that framework or umbrella for me. My feeling is, my thesis is that if you stopped 10 people on the street and said, I'm gonna tell you a word, and I want you to tell me the first thing that pops into your head when I say the word. The word is home. You would probably get about 8 different answers. For some people it's a place. For some people it's a building. For some people it's a feeling. For some people it's an aspiration. For some people it's something that you're running toward, trying to achieve. For other people it's maybe something that you're running away from. And so I thought that there were all sorts of stories that it was possible to tell under this broad narrative umbrella of a broad definition of home, and that kind of fit the bill for the sort of storytelling that I wanted to tell. And so I reached out to friends, and I started telling them as much as I knew about the idea at the time, which was not very much, and kind of collecting stories, collecting strings, saying, tell me about your home, tell me about the place where you live, tell me about your house, tell me about your neighborhood. When did it become home for you? The place that you moved from to get there, when did that stop being home? And I didn't exactly know what it was I was looking for. I was just trying to gather as much information as I could. And I was having lunch with a friend of mine named Mark Perry, and he had told me previously that there was some intriguing history in his house. And I knew that I didn't want this to be a podcast about houses, and I think that's a misconception about it among some people that I've met. It's a home design show or something like that, and right. It's probably my fault for including the word home in the title. But that I wanted it to be I wanted it to be about home conceptually rather than buildings. But with Mark, I had a dim recollection that he had told me something, a story about his house. He lives in Los Feliz here in Los Angeles, up by Griffith Park, and he told me a few things about it. And I said, no, that's not it. And he said, well, maybe who you really ought to be talking to is my husband, who's also named Mark, because his house has a story. And so I stumbled into this story that became the first real episode of Home after the introductory episode. And it was the story of a guy named Herman Stein, who was a staff composer at Universal International Pictures in the 1950s into the early 60s. And he composed the music for many of the great horror and monster and space movies that they were making at Universal International at that time. He was sort of the great unknown figure in staff composers. And he was an interesting guy, and he had an interesting life in what we now think of as the golden age of Hollywood, and a kind of sadly interesting life in the period after, and died in the house that my friend Mark now owns. And Mark has made it his mission in living in this house to keep alive the memory of Herman Stein. And I thought, that's the kind of story I want to tell. It is about a house, yes, but more broadly, it's about a home. And so I interviewed Mark. I interviewed both Marks, Mark, and I interviewed the woman who lives down the street from them and across the street from the Herman Stein house, who struck up a relationship with Herman Stein while he was still alive. And I got very lucky stumbling onto a guy named David Schechter, who was Herman Stein's friend and musical executor and kind of his right hand for the last years of his life, who gave me a lot of great insight into this very unusual and very touching story about the way this guy lived out his life in that house on that hill in Los Feliz. And the story just kind of fell together. I find with a lot of these stories, when I go to sit down and interview people, and it's always been true, whether it's interviewing for print or for the podcast, and they say, well, what's this story going to be about, or what's this episode going to be about? The most honest answer I can give them at that stage is, I don't really know yet, because you find the story in the reporting. You may have a general idea of what the area is that you want to go over, the ground you want to cover, but you never really know what the story is until you talk to the people. And so talking to these people, I kind of settled on a shape for the story. And I was lucky in that there were certain compositional elements that were sort of obvious. They were no-brainers. Well, there's music. The guy was a composer. And David Schechter now controls the rights to Herman Stein's music. And so very generously, he provided me almost carte blanche to use a lot of the music that he had under his control. And so I was able to kind of integrate that into the story. And I kind of felt my way along as far as the other elements were. And the thing where I really got lucky was I was starting to feel as I reported this story that I really wished there was some way that I could have Herman Stein's voice in the story, but he had died in, I think it was 1997. And at one point, without even really thinking, I was talking to David Schechter, and he said, "Yeah, I still have some voicemails of Herman's. He left voice messages for me, and I had this feeling that he wasn't always going to be around forever. He was an old guy. He was sick by then, and so I took the tapes and I put them in my safe deposit box. And I said, can you still get them?
Perfect.
Could you? And he said, I think so. And so, because just that casual little thing that he happened to remember and happened to mention to me, and with my heart in my throat, I said, do you think you could maybe digitize one or two of them and send them to me as MP3s? That enabled me to end the piece with the voice of the dead subject and kind of bring the story to a really satisfying conclusion. So I sort of stumbled on all of those elements as I went through, and in the process, I think I kind of started the process of developing a template for how I wanted to tell these stories as I went forward.
So what was the timeline on this first episode assembly? How long were you in production, if you will?
The one thing I did that was intelligent before the first batch of 6 episodes was I took a lot of time before I ever told anybody about it, because I knew,
right.
I knew that as soon as I was on the record, even with my friends, then I really had to do it. And at that point, I didn't have a whole lot of confidence that I could deliver 1 episode or 6 or 12. And so I kind of kept it to myself for a while, and I started having these lunches and dinners and coffees with people and gathering their stories. And I think once I started to report in earnest, I started probably in July and August of last year. And I really reported very intensively through the summer of last year, including a story in which I went out to the Mojave Desert to do a story about an old Route 66 ghost town called Amboy. And that's what kids, if you want to start a podcast, be sure to go to the Mojave Desert in August, because that's just good planning.
It sounds warm. It sounds a little warm.
It was a little warm. Yeah. And so I was able to kind of gather all that reporting together before the first episode was ever released, which I think was in September of last year. So that's kind of become the norm for me now. I've done 2 seasons of 6 episodes, and then I kind of step back for a little while, which is the process I'm in right now as we're talking, and develop stories for the next season, and do some fresh reporting, because the reporting is the most time and effort intensive part of the process. It's funny because for me, it's the part of the process that I kind of have the most experience with and the most familiarity with. And the technical aspects are still really technically demanding for me. But reporting is a whole other thing, because you got to find the right people. You have to identify them. You have to get them to talk to you. And much to my chagrin, I find after all these years that they don't work on my schedule. They work on their schedules. And so if I have a production deadline and I really need to get to somebody in the next week, well, that doesn't necessarily mean they can talk to me in the next week. So you have to leave yourself a long lead time to accommodate to all of that. So all of those things, kind of elongate the production process before you ever get to the point where you're ready to start tracking or mixing the elements. So that's kind of how the process started to develop for me.
You told us about music in episode 1, but music has been through all the first 2 seasons, all 12 episodes, a significant component of Home all along. Was that by design, or sort of something that just kind of kept carrying over from episode 1? I mean, music seems to be a big part of this.
Yeah, it was by design, although I didn't have a sense of how much music I wanted to use and how central I wanted it to be to the rhythm of the pieces. I listened really hard to how other podcasters that I admire use music. The Memory Palace is a good example of that. Did I want to go wall to wall like Nate does under the Memory Palace pieces? Did I want to use music for more punctuation, or more emphasis, or as transitions? And I think these are all the questions that anybody comes to. And what I arrived at was a sort of a hybrid of those two things. I don't tend to go wall to wall with music under my narration. My stuff is formally scripted. It's not informal. It sort of strives to be conversational, but it's all written. And the music that I use, I've sort of evolved to a point where I use it now for a couple of reasons. One, as I say, is transitional, and the other is to kind of underscore moods at certain points, although you don't want to bang people over the head with that kind of thing. Additionally, with music, as everybody knows, you run up against issues of legality and licensure. And one of the great days in the short history of this podcast is the day I discovered Poddington Bear. Are you familiar with Poddington Bear?
Yes, he appears on many a show I listen to.
Well, he does, and he is a guy named Chad Crouch, I think is his real name. He lives up in Portland, Oregon, and he has produced an enormous library of music that is free for non-commercial use under a Creative Commons license. And there's all sorts of tracks of every length and every instrumentation and every mood, and he's enormously generous to put those out there to people. And so I always try to mention him specifically by name when I can, because those have been really tremendously useful to me, those tracks, in helping to bridge segments, to underscore segments, because I did realize pretty early on that music was going to have a significant role in telling these stories, although at the start, as I say, I was not certain exactly what that was going to sound like.
So you're more or less producing kind of seasons in mass. You're sort of working simultaneously on several different episodes during a season. Is that fair to say?
That's fair to say.
So in between 1 and 2, looking back at the first season, how did it feel at this point? This was kind of your first, launch of it into the new medium. Looking back at that body of work, were you happy? Did you say there's things I want to change for season 2? What was that feeling in between 1 and 2?
I was pretty satisfied with the way the first episode came out. I mean, I'm never completely satisfied. I'm really hard on myself. But as I look back at those initial episodes, the Herman Stein episode, the second episode was an episode about a guy who took several years and absorbed an enormous amount of personal indebtedness on a mission to create a monument at the site where the Beach Boys' house was, the house that they grew up in Hawthorne, California, which is now literally a freeway embankment. The house isn't even there anymore. And then that story about Amboy, the old Route 66 town, a story about a guy named Andy Puddicombe who had lived all over the world training in Buddhist technique and landed in Venice, California to start an online meditation platform called Headspace. And then a story about the San Fernando Valley, and I ended that first season with a story called Ghosts of the Carlotta, about a real estate development that's going up in Hollywood and displacing a lot of people who lived in this fabulous old 1920s apartment building for a long time. I felt like that was a pretty good mix of stories, that the thing started to develop its own voice and its own rhythms as it went along. I was able to sort of carry those rhythms and that voice forward into season 2 with some refinements. As I say, the technical part of it remains a challenge for me because I really don't know what I'm doing, and there are days when Logic Pro will eat my files, and those are always fun days for me and the wife. And the dogs know to leave my office and leave me alone. They kind of slink off and give me a wide berth on days like that. But the days when something inexplicable and horrible and catastrophic of a technical nature happens are fewer and fewer. I'm developing better workflows. I'm working smarter. And so I think I'm getting better at it as I go along. And the surprise for me was that I discovered really as early as that first episode that I had a little bit of facility for telling stories in this way because my technical background is nil. It's absolutely nil, and I have no real radio background to speak of either, except for having done radio in college a million years ago, like every other guy of my age in America. So it's been an interesting process. It's been a tremendously satisfying process, and as the thing starts to get out there and develop a little bit of its own identity, it's just been tremendously satisfying to talk to people about it and to get their feedback on it, and the process continues. I'm looking forward to being at Podcast Movement, as I know you are, in July.
Yes.
And having an opportunity to meet some people that I really only know online at this point. And I was talking to Harry Duran, who does Podcast Junkies, and he was talking about the previous podcast movement, and he said it's great because you kind of get to be with your tribe. And I thought that was a lovely way to put it. So I'm looking forward to doing that in July and to picking up some more technical expertise as I go, because God knows that's something we all can use, especially me.
Yeah, I joined another podcast that recorded last night. It's out next week, and we were talking about podcast movement, and I said, I'm still in that role, as I imagine most of us are, that more often than not, you come across people in your life, people in public, and you're still answering the what's a podcast question.
Right, sure.
But in Chicago, the first week of July, we're going to be surrounded by 1,500 to 1,700 people that question won't come up at all.
Yeah.
And that in and of itself will be a unique environmental shift for me. So I'm definitely looking forward to it.
Yeah, I think it's going to be fun.
I want to talk a little bit, Bill, about reception, and I'm going to place this here and correct it and slide it around on the timeline if I'm wrong here. But sometime after the end of season 1 and as season 2 came, I think this is when I started to see a lot more critical acclaim and mentions and awards and write-ups and different things coming your way. What was sort of the public reception as things were coming out, and what's this process been like for you on that front?
That's been very gratifying. As we're talking now, within the last 24 hours, the Timbre, the online journal about podcasting, has kind of officially gone out of business, which is really a shame. Devin and Eric, the founding editors, are on to other things, and they were really the first ones, I have to say, early in season 1, who kind of picked up on the show and gave it a boost. That was an early boost for me, and I've always been tremendously grateful to them for doing that. Along the way, and you're right, it was really between seasons 1 and 2, which would have made it, I can't remember exactly when, earlier this year, or late last year, I guess, when a couple of other things started to hit. Again, thanks to Devin and Eric, they did a piece for The Atlantic on the 50 best podcast episodes of 2015, and they were very generous to include the Herman Stein episode, The House on the Hill, as one of that 50, and that was a tremendous boost and very gratifying and a real validation. And I got some coverage in other places as well. the LAMag.com, the website of LA Magazine, did a very nice short piece about me. Actually, a couple of them now about the podcast. And so it's this process, little by little, of kind of getting the word out, because that, I think, is the thing that a lot of us really struggle with. The ability, we saw this in blogging, and now we see it in podcasting. When everybody can be their own publisher or their own network, everybody will, and that means that there is a tremendous population of shows out there of all sorts of types and natures and levels of quality, and kind of breaking through that fog and into the forefront of people's consciousness is a real challenge, I think, for all of us. And so this, the whole question of podcast discovery and podcast promotion is something that I wrestle with all the time, because I don't think it's a given by any means that somebody who has the facility to do what we do also has the facility to promote it. There are different skill sets entirely, but you kind of got to do both. Right. If you want people to be exposed to your show, you have to make sure you get it in front of them in some fashion. And so that's kind of the biggest ongoing challenge for me is getting it in front of people. And, probably along those lines, the biggest thing that happened to the show between season 1 and season 2 is I was in Philadelphia, and I got an email from Mark Frauenfelder, the founding editor of Boing Boing, for whom I'd done some writing. And he had also written a very nice complimentary piece about the podcast in its early days. And he said, "Are you with a network? Is the show with a network now?" And I said, "No, it's not." And he said, "Well, we've got this podcast network, and there's some really good shows on it, like Mark's own show, Gweek, and Futility Closet, and You Are Not So Smart, and Flash Forward." And I said, "What would you think about joining the the Boing Boing Podcast Network? And I said, yes, please. Um, this has many advantages for a podcaster. The principal among them, I think, is just kind of the imprimatur of Boing Boing, which is a tremendously influential voice in online culture. And so as those episodes get up, to be prominently featured on Boing Boing for a day or two or three at a time is really a tremendous driver of traffic and a tremendous stamp of validation. So I've been really very grateful for Boing Boing's support in this thing and for Mark's support in particular, because he was a fan of the podcast first. And so all of those things, as I've gone along over the last 8 or 9 months, you kind of lurch forward, one step forward, 2 steps back, 2 steps forward. You get a write up here. You have a social media presence there. You're on Twitter. You're on Facebook. You're on Instagram, trying to figure out how to make that pay in an audio.
I wonder if that'll be a podcast movement session. How to make Instagram work for a podcast? Because I would pay. I'm still struggling with it.
I would pay you cash money to do that episode, because honestly, I'm still trying to figure out how to make that one work. But it's a process. It's an evolution, and the thing you want the thing to find its people, and the challenge is always for me going forward how to get it in front of the people who will respond to it, and that's the other job besides producing the podcast, is getting it to the people who will respond to it and who will appreciate it.
Yeah, you mentioned you're joining Boing Boing, and I remember when that news came out, I was like, "Oh, that's so cool!" You are not so smart. I went through probably about a 6-month obsession with that show.
Oh, it's a great show. Yeah,
I got hooked on that and couldn't stop. It was right when I was starting out, I think, and eventually, like, too many things. I've had to sort of move on with my subscription list because it's just a never-ending, subscribe and unsubscribe, subscribe and unsubscribe.
Yeah.
But yeah, that is a great home, no pun intended, for home, and I'm super happy for you that has come your way, because as far as I'm concerned, anything that brings more attention to the work you're doing, Bill, I think is a positive, because I love the show, and I'm looking forward to what's next. I know you're coming back in June. That's the plan?
That's the plan, and that could be, June 29th or 30th at this point, because you notice I wasn't date specific about it. I technically give myself the entire month of June to come back, and the expectation is that it will be another season of 6 episodes. That seems like kind of the sweet spot for me in terms of my energy level and my time commitments. And it's going to be more of the same going forward.
Well, if you put at least one out in June, then we'll have something to tell everybody about in Chicago.
Yeah, well, there's also that week that we're going to be in Chicago, so I'll have to kind of work around that, obviously. Yeah, but
And just to go back, and I feel like I'm relaying all the news now. Have you heard from Devin this week at the Timbre?
I just got an email from her a little while ago about her news about Millennial, which is fabulous. What a great thing for that show. Really happy for Devin. She's she's one of those people, and it must be the same thing with you, Dan. Either people that you feel like even though you've never spoken to them face to face, which is one of the reasons why I'm so looking forward to Chicago. Devin is one of those people who, as I said before, has just been enormously supportive of Home, and I know that I'm sure it must have been a wrenching thing for them to fold the Timbre, because it was so good and they were working so hard on it. And so for her to land with the Millennial podcast with Megan Tan is just it's a great thing for her. I couldn't be happier for her.
Yeah, Devin Taylor with the Timbre, she was really, really good to me. I remember I had her, she was my guest for episode 50 on my show. And what was funny was when I pitched to her coming on the show, she kind of wasn't sure. She hadn't really been on, I don't know, many, if any, podcasts at that point. But so we actually had a pre-conversation about sort of what we would talk about before she actually came on. And that pre-conversation, I really wish I would have been recording it. I didn't, of course, but we talked for over an hour that time. time. And then when we actually hopped on, I think at the time of episode 50, that was my longest episode yet, because she is just a great person to talk to, loves this whole industry and medium, and I like you, love what they were doing at the Timbre, and I'm just so happy she's kind of going to be working with Megan and Millennial, and I think that's a great fit. So I echo all your sentiments there, Bill.
Yeah, and I'm she and Eric were very supportive to me early on, and one of the things that Devin told me, and I've absolutely found it to be true, is she said, people in this podcasting space, she said, you're going to find are very generous, they're very kind, and they're very supportive. The word community gets thrown around a lot, but I have really benefited from the kindness of strangers since I've been doing this thing, and I think one of the reasons, aside from just the support that they gave the show, one of the reasons I'm going to miss the Timbre is that they wrote so well and so intelligently about podcasting that it helped me discover a lot of podcasts that I might not have discovered at all otherwise, or that it might have taken me a long time to tumble to. And I think there's this whole issue of podcast discovery that nobody has yet cracked. The iTunes store is kind of the default engine of distribution for these things, and it's fine. It works great when it works. And as a pure distribution engine, it works fine. But for discovery, not so much. And so, what I'm really hoping for over the next year or so is I'm hoping somebody's going to crack this nut of some engine, service, platform, app to recommend to people podcasts that they might not have the opportunity to come across otherwise, because there's so much stuff out there, and it's very, very difficult to sort of separate the wheat from the chaff. And so something like the Timbre, in my life will be very much missed.
I couldn't agree with you more, Bill. In fact, that was one of the main motivations for me starting this show, was the concept of, at least from my own personal perspective, all I can do is give it my own voice. But if somebody likes what I do, that every week I'm going to be in their ear telling them about a new show. I've recommended well over 100 plus shows at this point, and 70 interviews or so. And so hopefully I'm allowing people each week to find new stuff. And based on the feedback I'm getting, I'm constantly hearing back from people like, oh, I'd never heard of that, and I checked this out, and now I love it, and so on and so forth. So, I can't make a dent in the universe, but I'm trying to, advocate, that for that same discovery problem, and hopefully just, little pebble in an ocean type thing, but make a few waves. So I completely hear you with that as well.
Sure. And what you do and what Harry does, these things are tremendously useful in helping people find stuff that they're going to love, because there's something out there for everybody. There's such an enormous variety of styles and voices. The notion that the bar to entry is as low as it is, I think is in some ways a curse, and in some other ways a blessing. It gives rise to a welter of voices, and that's to the good. The question is, how do you find the stuff that you're going to respond to, and that's of a relatively high level of quality? So shows like yours, journals like the Timbre, the killer app that somebody hasn't coded yet, that is always just around the corner, that I can't wait for. All of those things are really enormously important in helping people kind of sort through the field.
I completely agree, and hopefully there will be that app, there will be that service, there will be, and I know there's a lot of people giving it a shot, right? I mean, NPR's got a sort of a recommendation-based website. I know Product Hunt is out there; they're trying, and Google Play's now online, and I know that they are. Through Google Play Music, there's a way that based on your listening habits, they will be throwing up new shows, automatically afterwards. And so there are a lot of people trying to crack that nut. I don't think the one true answer is there yet, but, people are definitely working on it. And hopefully we will all be in receipt of something better than what we have today in the near future.
I can't wait for that day.
Amen for that. That's for sure. Well, Bill, I really appreciate you coming on and taking the time and telling us a little bit about your past and home and what it's been like putting this show together. If folks are interested in checking this out, take just a minute, tell them where they can find everything.
The show is on the iTunes Store, and it's now at Google Play, and its home is at the website homestoriesla.net.
and those links will all be in the show notes as well, folks. I could not put a stronger recommendation behind Bill's work with Home. I love it. It's only got one bad thing about it, guys, and that is that there's only 12 episodes out there so far. So very easy to catch up, and wait with us till sometime before June 30th for season 3 to come, because I know I'm waiting, that's for sure. Bill, thanks again for taking the time.
Dan, thank you so much for having me. I really enjoyed it.
And folks, that'll do it for episode 90 of the Podcast Digest. Come back again next week, episode 91, another great interview. I said on Twitter today, folks, I've got 3 interviews and all lined up in the next week or so. Some good stuff is coming. So if you haven't yet done so, subscribe, rate and review on iTunes, tell a friend, all that fun stuff. Until next time, folks, my name's Dan Lizette from the Podcast Digest.
Thank you for listening to the Podcast Digest. You can follow the show on Twitter at PodDigest. Like the show on Facebook at facebook.com/The Podcast Digest. Email the show feedback at thepodcastdigest@gmail.com. And you can find all the previous episodes and exclusive blog entries at the show's website, thepodcastdigest.info.